at Northwood University. Hello and happy lunch hour, everyone. My name is Julia Damchek, and I am the Executive Director of Alumni Relations and excited to be with you today. Thank you all for joining us. I'm happy to introduce our speaker. Dale Moeller is an Associate Professor of History at Northwood. He received his PhD from CMU and his MSc from a very prestigious university in Glasgow, Scotland. I'll let him introduce that in more detail. Dale is going to review our current Omniquest book, which is Love Your Enemies by Arthur Brooks, and also share his historical perspective in regards to the book. Just some housekeeping items. Please remember that we are using the Q&A chat on your the right-hand column. So if you have any questions, we have. So we will be sending that out immediately afterwards. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Moeller.
Great, thanks Julie, and hi everyone. I can't thank you enough for having me here today. Historians always appreciate the opportunity to talk about history, but I think this is a really important topic, and I want to thank you all for spending your time here today. I'm hoping we can get some productive conversation out of it. My name is Dale Moeller. Thanks for the introduction, Julie. It's the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, by the way. But yeah, I want to get started. I have a ton of stuff to talk about, so I'm just going to move forward. I did want to say a few things about the Omniquest program here at Northwood. This is a long-standing program, and it's something that we work hard to incorporate into our campus life here. Every year we pick a book for faculty, staff, and students to read, think about, and talk about around campus. It's worked into a lot of classes. It's hopefully worked into a lot of discussions around, faculty meetings and committee meetings, but also student meetings. We hope that the students get a lot out of these books as well. This year we've chosen Arthur C. Brooks's Love Your Enemies, How Decent People Can Save America from the Culture of Contempt. And even if you haven't read the book, I think the title and subtitle does a good job kind of encapsulating what the book is about. I think all of us are aware of the culture of contempt that we're currently living in. This doesn't have to be a political conversation or anything like that, but there's certainly this sense that we have lost our ability to understand one another, and most importantly, our ability to talk with one another and solve the problems that need to be solved in the modern world, right? And I mean, Brooks talks about a lot of different things in the book. It's an excellent book. I can't recommend it enough. I really enjoyed reading it. But I think the most basic message he has is that, there are practical reasons to work together. This isn't a story of let's all feel good, let's have the warm and fuzzies inside, let's just all get along because that's what you should do. It's that, in a modern world where we all interact very, very closely all the time, and especially in a modern democracy or republic when the very way our government functions is resting on whether people can cooperate and talk across lines. It's just so fundamentally important. So I want to take some of the themes from Brooks's book today and extend them out into the past. I want to look specifically at a period in American history where, similar to today, I think people not only disagreed. Disagreement isn't a problem, and Brooks goes back to this over and over again. It's fine to have differing opinions. In fact, it's great to have differing opinions. Of course it is. But the real heart of contempt is the loss of that conversation, this kind of approach that I disagree so strongly that I'm not even going to recognize your point of view, or I'm not even willing to try to work with or among you to try to make the situation better. That is in many ways the practical problem with contempt, is that it stops problem solving. It stops democracies from functioning. And I think Brooks is trying to get at that with this book. Now, When you ask an American historian to connect some present theme to the past, you're probably going to get Abraham Lincoln. And so I apologize for the obvious choice, but I do think that in many ways, um, Lincoln has some really, really important things to say about contempt and how to overcome it. As much as I do love Brooks's book and the Omniquest program, I'm not sure Brooks can compete with Lincoln in terms of wise and, again, and more importantly, practical advice about how to deal with contempt and what to do with contempt. You know, Lincoln's the most studied American in history for good reason. I mean, he's often seen as kind of wise old Abraham Lincoln. I think a lot of us think of Lincoln as the statue, like the literal statue. We see him as a marble figure. His wise words are carved into stone all over the place. He's a remarkable figure. But one of the things I want to emphasize today in the short time we have together is the fact that Lincoln had his feet planted firmly on the ground. He coupled those very wise and elevated words with very practical understandings of the problems facing the United States during his time. And it's that wonderful combination of practicality and ageless wisdom that I really think makes Lincoln who he is. People at the time referred to the Lincoln music. I'll put that in quotes, the quote, Lincoln music. And it was this kind of indefinable quality that Lincoln had that was both, again, timeless wisdom. It was something that was very deep and very philosophical, and I'll give you an example of that later. But it was also very down to earth and very relatable. And that's a magical combination in the body of Lincoln. So I want to talk about what Lincoln tells us about contempt. And in many ways, it's the same argument Brooks is making in the Omniquest book. So we absolutely don't have time to get into the complexities of the Civil War, right? This is a very large topic. I mean, even here at Northwood, that's a 16-week class. So the idea of doing that over lunch break is probably a little bit ambitious. I do want to be clear, like slavery is the root of all of this, right? Slavery is the cause. But in order to understand that as a good historian, you have to three-dimensionalize that issue. And one of the things that really sticks out to me, especially living in this culture of contempt that we live in today, when I look back at the 1850s and 60s, is that fundamental disconnect that I sometimes feel in the modern world with other people. It's in the 1850s and 60s, right before the Civil War starts, that North and South finally have so much contempt for each other that they actually stop talking to each other and they stop trying to live in the same country with each other. I mean that figuratively here, like in their minds, they don't see themselves as being part of the same country. When a Southerner looks north and sees like downtown Manhattan, like this picture here, he doesn't see that as his America. His America is a farm America. It's an agricultural America. Frankly, it's a slave America. But it works the other way as well. Northerners who have been industrialized and urbanized, they're ready for a future of America. They're ready to take America into the modern age. And so when they look south, they see people who don't live up to their vision of America. Now, again, difference isn't a problem necessarily. It's okay for people, even in a democracy, to have different ways of life and different ways of doing things. But there's a problem when the conversation stops, right? And politically, it's a real problem. This is this is the detail that really does kick off the secession movement and the Civil War. This inability to politically address these problems. I do want to be very clear. These were problems that needed to be addressed, right? Like this is not an argument that the North and South should have met somewhere in the middle over the issue of slavery or something. Lincoln's very clear about that, especially toward the end of his presidency. What I'm really trying to get at here is trying to capture the sense of contempt that had taken over America prior to the Civil War. It's part of that story. Again, that's not to say that it's more important than like the slavery issue itself, but I think in order to understand how slavery caused the Civil War, you need to understand how contemptuous attitudes played into those conversations and indeed even ended those conversations. And thus I want to zoom in on what is one of the most famous speeches in American history, the speech Lincoln gave after winning the first presidential election that he won. The election was held in the fall of 1860, and he made the speech in March of 1861. This is a really interesting photograph because the Capitol dome wasn't completed when Lincoln got up to make this speech, and you can see some of the construction scaffolding up top as they were working on the dome. In between Lincoln's election in November and Lincoln's inauguration in March, the country had figuratively and literally fallen apart. Southerners, upon seeing Abraham Lincoln elected, were flabbergasted that this guy was going to be the president. His name wasn't even on the ballot in most Southern states. Like Southerners didn't even put him on the ballot. And so how could he have won an election? How could he have won a legitimate election, right? Don't these questions sound so familiar? Well, Lincoln won the election because the North was growing and the North was populous and it had a lot of voters. What I'm trying to get at here is that Southerners didn't see Lincoln as their president. They said that out loud. He's not my president. And folks, this is not about tweeting this out. This isn't a tweet with a hashtag, not my president or something. They mean this physically and literally. They met in their state capitals. They wrote up new constitutions for their states. They organized a new nation down there. Those states that left elected their own president. Again, not just a tweet. They are going through with this. I was trying to think of a more contemptuous thing that ever happened in American political history. Something more contemptuous than states deciding to elect their own president on their own. That's the very definition of political contempt, I think. Now, what's so interesting about this is not the way Lincoln sees this story. When Lincoln walks up the steps in March of 1861, although Southerners say he's not their president, Lincoln absolutely believes he's their president. Throughout the Civil War, Lincoln doesn't believe secession is either legal or possible. You can't secede. Those people did not leave the country. That is not another president over there. Lincoln fights against that political contempt the whole way through the Civil War. And that's what I really want to focus on. Now, Lincoln's arguments here are not really for the North. They're for the South. They're for these people who he wants to convince he is their president. And he's going to take a couple of approaches. And it's those two approaches I talked about on that earlier slide. Practicality, but also wisdom, right? So very down-to-earth ideas about why all of us just kind of separating and living our own lives isn't going to work. But then he's also going to kick it up a notch and really talk about some ageless philosophical ideas that might tie us together as well. So even though this is one of the most famous speeches in American history, I'd ask us to maybe reconsider these a little bit in light of the Omniquest book and what this is saying about contempt and the problems it presents to us. So here's Lincoln critiquing contempt from a practical point of view to those Southerners who would say, well, we disagree so much that we're not even part of the same country anymore. I'm going to live over here and you can live over there. We will just ignore each other. Here's what Lincoln says, quote, physically speaking, we cannot separate from each other. We cannot remove our respective sections from each other, nor build an impassable wall between them. Husband and wife may be divorced and go out of the presence and beyond the reach of each other, but the different parts of our country cannot do this. They cannot but remain face to face, and intercourse, either amicable or hostile, must continue between them. Is it possible then to make that intercourse more advantageous or more satisfactory after separation than before? Can aliens make treaties easier than friends can make laws? Can treaties be more faithfully enforced between aliens than laws can among friends? Suppose you go to war. You cannot fight always. And when, after much loss on both sides and no gain on either, you cease fighting, the identical old questions, as terms of intercourse, are again upon you, unquote. Lincoln is saying the same thing Brooks is saying in many of his sections in the book. Hating each other and having contempt for each other is doing no good. We are not progressing anywhere. We have problems to solve, the identical old questions, as Lincoln says. We have problems to solve, and we're not solving them with this contempt. Now, again, we want to be careful here because the problem that Lincoln is kind of dancing around here is, of course, slavery, which is a real problem. And Lincoln is going to be, especially toward the end of the war, adamant about the fact that slavery needs to end. But I think even Lincoln would say it can't end without the Southerners participating in the way that's going to work, right? It's got to be something that we don't do contemptuously. We cannot just separate. Right? We cannot just build a wall. In other documents, Lincoln talks about how there's no giant mountain range between North and South. There's no natural giant river that might separate these two countries. We are locked together. There's nothing we can do about it. We can disagree, but we cannot have contempt for each other. Now, that's very practical. It's very down to earth. It's very 2 feet on the ground. Lincoln is kind of speaking this down-home wisdom here. But Lincoln is also able to go into another gear. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but that Lincoln music, he was such a good speaker. He had a way of, it's almost like fooling your audience into thinking this is just some backwoods guy who's kind of talking very reasonable things. But then he would take it up into some philosophical realm that was really deep, actually. This is the last paragraph of that inaugural address. And I do want to remind us that the war hasn't started yet. There are no bullets flying. There is no blood been shed yet. The Southern states say they've left. Lincoln says they haven't. And he's really worried about what's going to happen next. Look at how he closes this speech. And boy, if you ever want to kind of get a sense of Lincoln's emotion about this, I think that first sentence really captures it. This is his last message to the South, really before the Civil War starts. Quote, "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the chorus of the Union, when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature," unquote. That's that Lincoln music I was talking about, right? That's quite an end to that speech. But look at what he's saying here, right? That like someday we're going to have to come back together. We're going to have to rediscover the mystic chords of memory. Our bonds of affection cannot be broken. And I think Lincoln, even if there is a war, is imagining a time when the chorus of the Union will again swell, when our hearts will again be touched by the better angels of our nature. Now, unfortunately, and anyone with an elementary understanding of American history probably knows this already, this doesn't work, right? Lincoln's pleas to get over our contempt for each other fail. The second inaugural, well, I mean, you can imagine how this plays out. People in the North cheered it as the greatest speech that was ever made. People in the South sneered at it and said, that's not our president anyway. I don't believe a word he says. Echo chambers. It feels so modern, right? At any rate, Lincoln's plea for, less contemptuous behavior fails. And what we get is the most destructive period in American history. Over the course of about 3.5 years, somewhere around 650,000 soldiers died. There were well over 1 million casualties, untold destruction and devastation. And just, again, lack of progress, right? Lack of advancement. But I don't want us to read this as like, okay, so what's the point? I think Lincoln would still, even after 4 long, war-torn years, Lincoln goes right back to the same message, right? The war is not the point of this discussion today. The point of this discussion today is contempt. And I'm impressed and amazed that war didn't change how Lincoln felt about this at all. Lincoln's whole goal at the end of the war is to get Americans at least talking to each other again. They don't have to agree, but they have to talk to each other. And so I thought I would start heading toward the end of this discussion by revisiting the Capitol steps 4 years later, March 1865, when Lincoln comes to give his second inaugural address. Maybe a little bit more famous than the first inaugural address, actually. And I want us to think about what Lincoln's position is here. He's the commander-in-chief of a victorious army. The war is just about over here. In fact, it's not unfair to say that the North has basically won by this point. He's a victorious commander. I think some people might even say he deserves a little bit of contempt for his defeated enemies. Think about how a Roman emperor would make this speech. Frankly, think about how Napoleon Bonaparte or Adolf Hitler would make this speech. Here's how Lincoln addresses his crowd, this northern crowd that's full of victorious might. Here's what he says, quote, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations," unquote. Again, that doesn't sound like a victorious general, right? It doesn't sound like someone who, is lording his victory over his defeated enemies. That sounds like someone whose main goal is getting the business of democratic form of government, a government of, by, and for the people, as Lincoln would say, back on track. And again, if you need a comparison, think about how other victorious generals would make a speech here, what their speeches would sound like. I'm guessing they wouldn't sound like Lincoln's. Okay, I have to start moving toward the end of this. You might be saying, well, this is Lincoln. I mean, come on, Lincoln's up in the White House. He's a politician. He has to say these things, right? Like, who's really listening to these things? Well, I think you can point to some really clear evidence that Lincoln's leadership affects the way the war plays out. Lincoln does not mind if his generals are angry with the South, but he works really hard to fight against contempt for the South. Anger's fine. Going back to the Omniquest book, Brooks writes about this. He says it's fine to get angry. In fact, you should be angry about causes you really care about. Anger is an emotion you can use and channel to good effect. But boy, Lincoln doesn't want contempt because, of course, after the war, we're going to have to go back to being a country again. And so I think this is one of the ways to kind of illustrate how Lincoln's leadership disseminated down and played a role in the way the generals acted. I mean, Again, anyone with a brief knowledge of the American Civil War will know that William Tecumseh Sherman spent most of the war very angry at the South. His letters are full of vitriol about what he's going to do to the South, etc. Indeed, this photo here is from when he evacuated the city of Atlanta, one of the largest cities. He made everyone leave, and they didn't want to leave, but he made them leave, and he was pretty cold-blooded about it. But look what he says at the end of his statement to the people of Atlanta. Quote, "But my dear sirs, when peace does come, you may call on me for anything. Then I will share with you the last cracker and watch with you to shield your homes and families against danger from every quarter," unquote. For Sherman, he's angry at the war. And when he's angry at Southerners, he's angry at them for starting the war. He is following Lincoln's cues to try to get over his contempt as the war starts to come to an end, even as he's causing untold destruction to Southern troops and, frankly, Southern civilians sometimes. His eye is always on what's going to happen after the war and how we can become patriots again. I have to skip one slide. I have left out enormous chunks of this story. It's really hard, like I said, it's hard to do the Civil War. Focus on the way cooperation among different parties, including among white and black Southerners following the Civil War, led to quite a bit of progress in the immediate short. Dramatic steps that were not possible in a culture of contempt. But going further than that, I would also say that the culture of contempt reestablished itself by the 1870s, 10 years after the Civil War. That communication that might have been happening between whites and blacks, Northerners and Southerners, rural and urban people, had again started to break down. And that's okay, last slide, then I'll stop. Some of you might be saying, this is all so long ago and so far away. Like, why should I care? These people were arguing about things that aren't important to me. Abraham Lincoln doesn't live in the world I live in. What could this possibly mean to me? But wise old Abe Lincoln even has something to say to that. He would say, don't be contemptuous of history. Don't think that history isn't worth a conversation either. Indeed, I'll just leave you with some words of wisdom from Lincoln about what we can do with the lessons from the past. Here's what he says after winning the second presidential election. Quote, "Human nature will not change. In any future great national trial, compared with the men of this, we shall have as weak and as strong, as silly and as wise, as bad and good. Let us therefore study the incidents of this, the past, as philosophy to learn wisdom from, and none of them as wrongs to be revenged," unquote. So yeah, I hope you all got a little sense of how contempt did play a role in the Civil War. You got a sense of how Abraham Lincoln fought against those contemptuous feelings and how that played out on the ground. And hopefully you got a little bit of an urge to read the book, because it is definitely worth reading. I can't recommend it enough. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dale. Again, I just want to thank you for doing this with us today. And it looks like we do have a few questions in the Q&A. All right, we'll start with the first one. Contempt for people can and must be overcome. What about ideas? some are inhumane. That's why we had the revolution and abolitionist movement that precipitated the Civil War. Isn't America split into two camps because of irreconcilable ideas such as pro-life versus pro-choice? Thank you, Alex Tokarov.
Yes, Alex, it's a great question. And I was running out of time because otherwise I would have mentioned some of the short phrases in Lincoln's second inaugural. Although he is talking about future cooperation and overcoming contempt, he does talk about, let God give us the strength to do what is right. I mean, he certainly has a vision for a fundamental change that is happening in the United States. And he certainly understands that there are people who disagree with that future course that he sees. But I think if Lincoln was standing here, he would say, Southerners were going to be involved in that process, one way or the other. And the same with the pro-life versus the pro-choice thing, right? No matter which side of that debate anyone falls on, the country as a whole is going to deal with the course of our actions for that. And so I think Lincoln would say that we have to work together on that. That sounds hard. It can sound impossible sometimes. But I think that's what Lincoln would say. But that's a great point, Alex. Absolutely.
We've got one more question from Alex. History shows that Lincoln was naive. Countries appear and disappear. Unions are formed and dissolved. Can a constitution forbid succession? Isn't that like someone selling not just his labor services, but himself into slavery?
Oh, another wonderful question. And these are both questions that I think Lincoln himself would have really liked. He thought about both of these things very carefully. I mean, one of the reasons why Lincoln was so married to the concept of keeping the Union together was because of all the doubts people had about democracies and republics in general. At the time of the American Civil War, the United States was the only major democracy on earth. The French had given it a shot, but that hadn't gone very well in the early 1800s. And I'm joking a little bit, but, Europeans were kind of taking bets on how long the American Republic would last. I mean, they thought this same idea that eventually there will be splits and it'll all fall apart. And this is why Lincoln, and a lot of people disagreed with him, absolutely. But this is why Lincoln saw the preservation of the Union as being something so important. For Lincoln, this wasn't just about the United States, and it wasn't just about America. It was about, right, as he says in the Gettysburg Address, it was about a new birth of freedom, that government of, by, and for the people shall not perish, right? Like it'll be here. It's our job to prove that we can overcome a faction that thinks it wants to leave. Now, again, I do want to emphasize, Alex, you're right. I mean, we've watched lots of countries fail. We've watched lots of constitutions fail. This is just the way Lincoln saw it. But he wrestled with it a ton. He thought about this a lot. Lincoln was a lawyer, after all, and so he thought about the ins and outs of constitutional legality all the time. Great questions.
All right, well, we're going to leave the Q&A open for 30 more seconds, so last chance to enter it if you are interested. Again, I want to thank everyone for attending. I want to thank Professor Moeller for doing this for us. We will email this out to you. We email it to everyone who logs in with their email address, so if for some reason you don't receive, let us know, alumni@northwood.edu, and we'll make sure to get that out to you. We also ask that you fill out the survey, let us know what you liked, what you didn't like. I think most usually want more of this, so let us know if you're looking for different topics, or if you want Professor Moeller to come back. We're happy to do that too, and I think he was excited to do this for us today. So I don't see any additional questions, so hopefully you can all join us next month. We're not sure of our exact topic yet, but we will be hosting another one in October, again on a Thursday, again over the lunch hour, so hope you can join us. And don't forget, we've got a big weekend coming up at Northwood University. Next weekend, it is our annual auto show homecoming weekend, where we will be hosting our alumni awards ceremony, along with a gala and the auto show and a football game and all kinds of fun stuff for you and your family to join us. So hopefully some of you, we'll see some of you next weekend, October 1 and 2. So again, thank you, and we will see you all next time.